Greetings, Pilgrim Auditorium class. This is the Sunday school lesson for June 21st, 2020. We are doing another one of Jesus' parables, just as we did last week. And today's parable will be taken from Luke 15. Luke 15 contains three separate parables, but each one of them addresses something that has been lost. The first one talks about something that's lost by circumstances. The second one talks about something that's lost by carelessness. And then the third one talks about something that has been lost by personal choice. I want to focus on this third parable, which is taken from, as I said, Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. Now, before we begin our discussion, I'm going to borrow a page from Randy Field's playbook. And I'm going to ask you to pause this video, get your Bibles or your smartphones, and read Luke 15, 11 through 32. As you read this, I'm going to ask you to try to avoid any distractions, at least as much as possible. I'm going to ask you to take your time reading it and try to imagine as if this was the very first time you were reading this narrative. And then third, try placing yourself in each character's place as you read this parable, and see if you can experience this narrative from each of those characters' perspective. And then when you have read the passage rather, then return back to this video and we'll pick up our discussion. So I'll see you back in a few minutes. Okay, welcome back. I hope that you were blessed with your reading this morning, and let's see what we can get from our study. I specifically chose this particular parable for today's study. With today being celebrated as Father's Day, I wanted us to study a passage that examines a father's relationship with his two sons and his responses to their individual reactions with him. So let's just jump right into it. I'm going to be looking first of all at verses 11 through 13. Then Jesus said, "A certain man had two sons, and the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me.' So he divided to them his livelihood. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living." Verse 11 introduces the three primary characters right off the bat in this parable. We have a father, and we have two sons. In verse 12, the focus immediately settles on the younger of the two sons. He comes to his father and he requests, quote, "the portion of goods that falls to me," unquote, from his father. Now, as the younger of the two sons, his portion would be 1/3 of the total value, while the older son's portion would be 2/3 of the total value, since he was due a double compilation of a normal portion, as we can read in Deuteronomy 21, verse 17. During Jesus' time, for a son to come to his father and request dispersal of his inheritance while his father still lived would have been considered arrogant, presumptive, insulting, even almost tantamount to the son saying, "Father, you have more value to me dead than you do alive." We are told, though, that the father, with no apparent pushback, quote, divided to them his livelihood, unquote. Notice the use of the pronoun them here. This indicates that the father officially recognized that everything that remained once the younger son had extracted his 1/3 portion, everything that remained belonged to the older son. Keep this in mind because this will come into play a little bit later in this parable. Verse 13 is presented in just a bare minimum of words, but nonetheless it tells us quite a bit about the character of the younger son. The phrase, "not many days hence," this indicates his apparent eagerness to leave the security of home, to leave the guidance and care of his father, to leave the companionship of his older brother, and to strike out on his own, most likely with a great deal of confidence in his ability. The phrase "gathered all together" implies that he placed much more value on the material goods comprising his inheritance than he did on the intangible aspects which he was so eager to leave. The phrase journeyed to a far country plays out his apparent inward drive to get as far away as possible from the memories, from the influence, from the emotional connections with the locale and community in which he had been raised. And the phrase wasted his possessions with prodigal living paints a picture of a young man living for the present day, living extravagantly, showing no wisdom at all in looking ahead and planning for what challenges may come. Some commentaries even lean toward land ownership having been part of the younger son's inheritance, and interpret this phrase as indicating that he had unwisely, perhaps even carelessly, sold off his property, his part of the property, to a Gentile buyer. Again, keep this thought in mind. It will come up later in our study. Let's return to our parable and read a few more verses, picking up in verse 14. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in the land, and he began to be in want. Then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. In verse 14, just one verse removed from the younger son being described as wasting his possessions, we find that he had depleted his entire inheritance. Plus, the situation for him was exacerbated by a famine. Actually, the passage says, quote, a severe famine had struck the land in which the younger son has settled. Thus, the younger son found himself in a very dire situation. This implies that the younger son had apparently applied none of his inheritance toward any substantial form of investments that he could fall back upon later. One also wonders if this is the very first time ever in the younger son's life that it could truthfully be said, quote, he began to be in want. Verse 15 paints a very stark contrast between the younger son who arrived in his new environs and the same young man now facing a severe famine. His pride had taken a hit when he had to resort to hiring himself out to do menial chores. Additionally, Jesus' Jewish audience would have cringed, certainly inward, and perhaps even uncontrollably outwardly, at the thought of this young Jewish man resorting to tending swine, designated by Jehovah God himself as unclean animals. Then verse 16 places this young man at the absolute lowest point of his brief life. He was so hungry as a result of the famine, plus having no means to provide food for himself, that his hunger pains led him to crave even those scraps that he regularly fed the unclean swine he was forced to tend. Luke even embellishes the youngster's deplorable state by noting that not one single person stepped forward to help him, not to ease his physical needs, not to ease his wounded pride. Returning to our passage, let's look at verses 17 through the very first line of 20. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father. I will say to him, Father, I have sinned. I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. I've always considered verse 17 as a pivot point in this narrative for the younger son, especially this first phrase, but when he came to himself. Listen to how some other translations phrase this pivot point. The New International Version reads, when he came to his senses. The Contemporary English Version reads, finally he came to his senses. And The Living Bible combines both of those thoughts and reads, when he finally came to his senses. So notice how his attitude, his approach, his perspective pivots from this point where he came to himself, or he came to his senses. Now, in a clearer mental moment of reflection, he realized that there were servants back home, the home that he had willingly left, who were in a far better situation than the one that he now found himself. In verses 18 and 19, as a result of the younger son coming to his senses, plus his realization of how his situation paled in comparison to that of the household servants back home, we find him resolutely making plans to step up, be a man, and address the issue. Listen to what he said. He said first, I will arise. This simple physical action is a beautiful allegory to his need to lift himself out of his mental and emotional pits of despair where he had found himself. He said, I will go to my father. This indicates that even though he was the one who had personally cut off their relationship, he now acknowledges that the father is still the one who held the answer to his recovery. He said, I will say to him. This seems to say he had laid aside his pride with an intention to present the following four statements in a heartfelt plea to his father. I will say to him, I have sinned against heaven. I will say to him, I have sinned before you. I will say to him, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And I will say to him, I am willing to let you make me like one of your hired servants. Truly a pivot in this young man's life when the reality of where he found himself after he had exhausted what he thought would perhaps bide him for the rest of his life, and how he changed his perspective and now has set himself on what he will do to address the situation. As verse 20 begins, the younger son followed through on his intention to return home, even though he perhaps and probably did not expect what actually awaited his arrival. Let's return to our passage. Look at the remainder of verse 20 through verse 24. Remember, verse 20 began, and the son arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his finger, on his hand, and put sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf here, and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. And they began to be merry. Verse 20, after beginning with the son's intention to return home, in fact it said that he arose and came to his father. Verse 20 continues this picture of his return. Again, we have another verse that's sparse on words, but it tells us a lot, this time about the father's character. Note the actions that were taken by the father. The father saw his younger son when he was a great way off. What does that tell you? Sounds a lot to me like the father had a habit, perhaps a daily habit, of watching, looking down the road for that young man's return. Next, the father had compassion. The younger son may have been long absent from the father's sight, yet the younger son had never been absent from the father's heart and the compassion that dwelt there. The father ran to the son. Was this simply to welcome the son home? Perhaps that's all it was, or perhaps not. Another thought to hold on to till we finish this verse, and we'll come back to that. The father fell on his son's neck. I picture a father overcome with relief. And again, hold on to that thought. We'll expound further on it, on that perspective shortly. The father kissed his son. The younger son had left a pigsty. He had made the journey from a far country, according to verse 13. He came, no doubt, filthy, smelly, a physically repulsive sight. But what did the father see? The father saw through the mud. The father saw through the sweat. The father saw through the unkempt appearance of the younger of his beloved offspring. And he kissed him. And I believe that's an ongoing phrase there. He kissed the son, and kissed the son, and kissed the son. Returning to the picture of the father running to meet the son, two cultural factors need to be considered. The first cultural factor is, in Jesus' time, a mature man never willingly ran, because it would require hitching up his loose tunic, and this would reveal the fellow's legs, which would have been a shameful thing to witness and would have brought shame upon any man that took that action. Another Jewish tradition addressed the scenario of the son losing his inheritance, as we thought about earlier, perhaps even losing it to a Gentile. If that had been the case, a son who had lost his inheritance to a Gentile and then attempted to return home, the community would welcome him, but they would not welcome him. They would greet him as he arrived at the town or the community, and they would perform a ceremony called Kezazah, K-E-Z-A-Z-A-H. This ceremony consisted of an earthen pot being shattered in front of the son, and that would act as a public proclamation that he was to be cut off from his family and cut off from the community. As a result, the community would thereafter shun such an individual. Some commentators believe that when the passage says his father ran to greet his son, not only does it mean he was willing to bear the shame that would bring upon him as an older man running, but they also contend that he ran to meet his son before he reached the village outskirts, to welcome him there, to publicly proclaim, I welcome my son back, and prevent the Kezazah ceremony taking place to publicly shun and shame his son. With verse 21, we find the younger son responding to his father's welcome. He began delivering the statements that he had determined back a few passages earlier to proclaim before he even began his journey, with one exception. His father never left an opening for the final prepared statement the son had, where he wished to say, I am willing to let you make me like one of your servants. Because at this point, the father spoke up, beginning in verse 22, that presents us with the father's first words. Notice the father's first recorded words were not words of rebuke to the son. They were not words of, I told you so. They were not shame-inducing epithets. His first words were to the household servants. The first words recorded from the father were, he spoke to the servants, and in doing so, he made plain the position of the returning son in the household hierarchy. Notice what he instructed the servants to put on the son. He said, first of all, put the best robe on his back. Now, some more cultural considerations. The best robe was typically a robe that the master, the father of the house, would reserve to have placed upon the back of special guests. Secondly, the father told the servants to place a ring on his finger. Not just any ring, mind you. I take this to be a signet ring of some sort that, again, culturally was used to signify this individual, this son, carried authority on behalf of the father through the bearing of the signet ring his father had presented. And then thirdly, the father instructed the servants, bring some sandals and put them on his feet. Again, culturally speaking, in this time frame, in this environment, sandals were typically worn by free men, never by servants, household servants. So, bring the best robe, treat him as a special guest. Bring the ring on his finger. I want to acknowledge he has authority as my son. And bring the sandals on his feet. He's not going to be treated as a servant, even though the son never even got to make that statement. He's going to be treated as the free man he has always been. And then verse 23 continues the father's instructions to the servants. He says, bring a fatted calf. Again, culturally speaking, a fatted calf, when prepared, could generally feed an entire community of guests. And he said, kill the calf, for I am proclaiming a joyous feast to be observed on his behalf. Verse 24 reveals the reasons behind the father's proclamation of this feast of joy in welcoming his son. He says, my son was dead and is alive again, and my son was lost and is found. True to the father's wishes, verse 24 tells us, the feast began. Let's return to our reading to see the next character who makes a prominent appearance in our narrative. Reading verses 25 through the first passage of verse 28. Now the older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and the sound of dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And the servant said to him, your brother has come, and because he has received him safe and sound, your father has killed the fatted calf. But he, the older son, was angry and would not go in. Verse 25 introduces the third main character in this narrative, the older son. We are told that he had remained with his father when the younger son had left, and apparently the whole time the younger son was gone. He had been at work in the field, in fact, at the time of day when the younger son had returned, and as the older son neared the house, he heard the sounds of the joyous feast that the father had proclaimed on behalf of the returning son. We're told he heard the music and he heard the dancing. He heard this commotion. Verse 26 and 27, we find the older son learns the source of the cheerful music and the sounds. He learns, first of all, his brother had returned from self-imposed exile. Hang on to that thought, referred to as his brother. He learned, secondly, his father had welcomed his brother back into the fold. And thirdly, the older son learned his father had had the fatted calf killed in honor of his brother's return and had proclaimed the feast which the older son now hears from those that are participating. Verse 28 gives, the first sentence in verse 28 gives us a one-sentence synopsis of the older brother's reaction to this news. Quote, but he was angry and would not go in, unquote. Let's read the final verses of our narrative and see where this takes us. Verses 29 through 32. 28. the rest of 28 and 32. 28 opens with, he was angry and would not go in. Therefore his father came out and pleaded with him. But the son answered and said to his father, Lo, these many years I've been serving you. I have never transgressed your commandment at any time. And yet you ever gave me a young goat that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this son of yours came, who has devoured your livelihood with harlots, you killed the fatted calf for him. And the father said to him, Son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. It was right that we should make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive again, and was lost and is found. Okay, in answer to the older son's stubborn attitude that he was angry and he was not going to come in and participate in the feast, the father came outside and met him. We see the diplomacy of the father here. He came out to the older son, and we're told he pleaded with him to join the festivities. Note, throughout this narrative, this diplomatic, compassionate, loving, forgiving father has left the house twice, once for the sake of each son. Verse 29 and 30 reveals the older son's response to his father's pleas for him to join. He reminded his father, he said, I remained at home and I've been working many years. So an indication of how long the younger son had been gone. The second claim is a little suspect. He said he claimed to have never transgressed any commandment from his father at all in all of that time. That's a little dubious claim for me to accept, but that's the claim he made. He also complained that he had never received as much as a young goat to celebrate with his friends, much less a fatted calf that could feed an entire community. And finally, he made an accusation. Notice the wording he used. He says, this your son. He refused to even refer to him as my brother. He accused his brother, the father's other son, of wasting the father's money on harlots. Once again, where's the evidence for such a claim? How could he have known how the son had spent the money? He certainly hasn't spoken to him. Then verse 31 and 32 present the final picture of a loving, compassionate, forgiving father's effort to mollify this older son who had felt so mistreated. The father, yes, he acknowledged the loyalty of the older son during the years that the younger son had been absent. And he also reminded the older son that everything the father now possessed would constitute his entire inheritance, since earlier, years before, the younger son had already claimed his portion of the inheritance. And finally, he asserted to his older son, it was right. He repeated what he had told the servants when he instructed them to prepare the great feast. He says, because he, my son, your brother, was dead and is alive again. He, my son, your brother, was lost and is found. Notice for good measure he used the phrase, your brother, just to remind the older brother where they both fit in this household hierarchy. Of course, this parable has been presented multiple times with the understanding, the interpretation that the Father represents God Himself. The two younger sons represent children of God under different circumstances. We see in the Father, we see a willingness to let one of his children make decisions that the Father doesn't agree with. We see a willingness for one of his children to break the relationship that the Father would rather not be broken. We see the Father still watching continuously for that separated son, child, to return. And we see a father eager, running, compassionate, kissing, and I believe with tears to welcome the returning son, child that is left the fold, if you will. We also see a father who wants those who do not take such drastic measures to understand that they need to be aware of their relationship with God the Father as well, that they can make improper assumptions and place themselves in jeopardy of being separated from the love and forgiveness of the Father. For my final thoughts on this passage, I want to look at three principal characters in this parable: the father, the younger son, the older son, and three basic assertions, one that was made by each of the principal characters. I want us, basically you, I've already done this, I want you to consider these assertions, determine in your mind who in this narrative could have been understood to have made this assertion, and think through what that tells us about the character and about the final outcome. One character, through his actions in this narrative, makes an assertion understood to us of, I have done wrong. Another character in this narrative, through his actions, makes an assertion that we could have understood being said as, I have been done wrong. And the third character, through his actions, makes an assertion that we could have readily understood. What I have done is not wrong. Thank you for joining and participating in our study today. I hope it has been a blessing to you. My prayer is that God is blessing you, blessing your family with good health, with safety, with ability to work in some fashion, that you are not being strained financially. I pray that you are, if you're comfortable, that you are able to attend what we have set up as our current form of meeting at the church building. Although once again, I still will not be able to do so due to exposure and quarantine. But take care of yourself. Keep your faith. Remain strong. And I look forward avidly, eagerly to the time when we can once again all meet in person to worship the Lord and Father in heaven and praise Jesus for his sacrifice that cleanses us of our sins. I pray you have a great week. Take care. I love you all. See you later.